So the conversations we're having about skills development have become too predictable. We've named the challenges, documented the disruptions, but what we desperately need are leaders willing to chart pathways forward. Welcome to Catalyst for Change, where we're not just reflecting on transformation, we are engaging with those who are engineering it. I'm Curtis Clark, and with my colleague Troy Kay, we are convening voices that challenge, provoke, and push boundaries, creating space for the conversations that aren't happening anywhere else. Today's guest isn't here to admire the problem. They're here to help us define and action what must happen next. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Matt Sigelman. Matt is president of the Burning Glass Institute, a nonprofit data laboratory working at the intersection of the future of work and the future of learning to advance economic mobility, shared prosperity, and improved outcomes for workers and learners. Named by Forbes to its Future of Work 50, Matt has dedicated his career to bridging the gap between talent and opportunity. Matt, welcome to Catalyst for Change.
Curtis and Troy, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It is our honor indeed. Matt, let's jump into this. You've argued that the economic development strategy requires a talent strategy, and a talent strategy requires a learning and education strategy. Yet in most jurisdictions, these three domains operate in silos, different ministries or departments, different metrics, and different planning cycles. Are there examples or jurisdictions where you've seen these silos come together in some form of harmony? And how has that actually unfolded?
So I wish I could point to Nirvana. We were talking about rock and roll a minute ago, and so maybe it's appropriate to start there. But what I will say is this: there are some places which are at the forefront of pushing that alignment from different directions. I'll talk about a few different places where we've really seen that come together. Recently, we've been working in Houston, Texas, and through the Greater Houston Partnership. And the Greater Houston Partnership is an employer-anchored economic development collaboration. And that's been very significant as a place to start, because what it's done is it's given a industrial or commercial impetus to think about talent. We needed to realize that an economic development strategy needs a talent strategy. You can't actually grow a sector if you don't have the people to do it. It seems like a really basic concept, but it's surprising how seldom we actually put the cart before the horse, or how often we put the cart before the horse, or how seldom we realize that, wait a second, we're going to have a problem here realizing on this vision because we don't have the people to do it. And how do you get the people? You get it through education. And I bring that up because what we were able to do in Texas with the Greater Houston Partnership is to say, okay, let's actually identify that set of jobs which we should all care about. Every job is important. Every job brings dignity, but there's some jobs that are at this kind of intersection of they are critical to the region's economic growth and to the sectors that the region sees as strategically important. Employers already can't get enough talent into those jobs. And these are jobs that are associated with very high rates of economic mobility. So whether you're a policymaker who is really focused on economic growth, whether you are a business just trying to make sure that you can keep operating, or whether you're a labor advocate, in all cases, these are the sets of jobs that you've got put front and center. And so we start by then saying, okay, can we get alignment around that? Can we bring models to bear that help us identify what those jobs are overall, sector by sector? And then can we get employers to validate that? Then we can start to do that backward step of saying, okay, we've got those goals in place. Now, what's the talent that we can pull into this? A lot of areas focus on pulling talent in. That's been a key strategy for a lot of places, and some places are able to manage that. Certainly, there's cities like Vancouver and Toronto, for example, strong immigration moving in. But for most cities, The real question is not how do you pull talent in, but how do you pull talent up?
Hmm.
And so once we understand where we're trying to pull, what are the jobs we're trying to pull people into, then we can define what those jobs require. What skills are we going to need to support that talent base? Then we can say, where else in our economy do we find people who have those skills, who are under leveraged today, who are working below their potential? What are the skills that would bridge the gap? That allows a new approach altogether to the way that we approach education and training too, because it says not how do we train people up from scratch for those jobs, which means that either you're only focused on career launch or you're trying to take people out of the workforce for a really long time while you train them up from scratch, but instead to say, how do we honor the skills that those workers already have? How do we build on top of them? And how do we do this as efficiently as possible by just solving for that gap? That's something which has been transformative. I'll give you two other quick
Hmm.
examples. One of those is in Detroit, Michigan, with the Detroit Regional Workforce Partnership. And where we started there was the notion of actually saying, can we align, perhaps before we even align on a set of jobs, can we align on a set of things that we all want to track? How do we know what good looks like? What's going on? Where is opportunity growing? Where is talent stalling out? What are the ways that we all agree across a set of stakeholders in education, in government, in the private sector, in community organizations? What are the things that we're all going to be pushing against? Whether it's, hey, we're going to make sure these jobs get filled, whether it's, hey, here's places where people are stalled, how do we get them unstuck? Whatever those priorities are, let's set those goals and let's figure out what metrics are going to tell us where we need to target action and whether we're being successful. And then the third place, as we're looking on the peripheries of Nirvana, take us across the ocean to Singapore. And been lucky to get to do some work both with they call Skills Future Singapore and also with the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore. And in both cases, the Ministry of Manpower is trying to translate where their economic development ministry is going and the plans of the sector skill councils into a work plan. And then Skills Future Singapore is the government's lifelong learning agency. And so it says, okay, now we understand where we need people. How do we help people get there? How do we make sure that people have a map and can identify the skills and have access to the resources and the financing to acquire those skills that will enable them to either stay relevant in their current field or reposition themselves into fields where they may have more opportunity?
And that's perfect because I think this will lead nicely into Troy's next question. But I also want to point out the fact that your example with Houston, I've used that example for work that I'm doing right now with the Mining Association of British Columbia, talking about talent accelerators. And what you framed beautifully in these three examples is what those examples are and the components of that. And it's really quite interesting how people have looked at this concept and went, wow, we've never thought about it in these ways, in this sort of ecosystem approach.
Yeah, I think to your point, one of the things that we lose sight of, we tend to get focused on a given job title. And we're looking for people who have that specific job title or have that exact credential that we're looking for. And so you get stuck in the zero-sum game mindset of saying there's only so much talent that's out there who can fill this role. The trick to breaking that mindset is being able to identify where's non-obvious talent. When you can start breaking jobs down to skills,
Mhm.
say a given job is really a bundle of capabilities. It's the skills that people need and the tasks that they perform. Then you can say who already has some of the proficiency that we need. And sometimes those are non-obvious. Looking a few years ago at jobs for cybersecurity analysts, not the deep engineers, but the analysts. And we found a surprising potential transition path from treasury analysts because they're both doing a lot of process auditing. They're both doing a bunch of compliance work. There's a fair amount of reporting commonality. And so you start to realize that here's some cyber analysts, which really hard to fill, treasury analysts, a little bit less hard to fill, and maybe a lot less exciting. Hey, is there a pathway there? No, that doesn't always mean there is one. If you were to look at you're trying to solve a shortage of doctors, you can
Mm.
look at skill overlaps and say, great, I see a job that has a 97% skill overlap in nurses. Can't get there from here. That take you a few years of training. It's always important to be able to validate those things, but you're
Right.
exactly right. We have to be able to look beneath the label.
Yeah. No, exactly. Troy, I'll turn it over to you because I think this is a nice segue into what you want to tease out here.
Yeah, it is. And thank you, Curtis. Matt, I was reflecting on the fact that you mentioned mindset shifts, and there's many actors who need to make that shift. So we have employers, we have educators, we have governments, we have training providers, we have workers themselves. Change is not going to happen everywhere all at once. And I think you've alluded in your examples in relation to Houston and Detroit and Singapore that there is a sequence there, there is a chain of events. So I'm curious, can you maybe talk a little bit about what has made the most sense, or where have you seen the most traction and momentum get built when you start to ask some of those foundational challenge questions or alignment questions that you alluded to as well? Like, where do we see things taking off the best?
So I think the most fundamental thing, we've seen a couple of different directions that you can approach this work from, but the key is to make sure that we're solving a problem for the actor. One of the problems that we often start from the intermediary, for example, public workforce agencies and others involved in trying to facilitate the connections. And that means they're trying to pull along the folks on either end, either the employers on the one side or the trainers and educators on the other side. And if instead you were to say, hey, look, how do we not think about a social problem? Obviously, when people are under leveraged in an economy, it is a social problem. But if we think about solving that problem by thinking about it as a commercial problem, it's an industrial problem, that there's sectors that or even sometimes as a national security problem, there's sectors that we want to win at. What's the talent that we're going to need? There's sectors that we as a business, or rather there's roles that we need as a business in order to be able to thrive. Where can we find them? And all of a sudden you have urgency and people who are invested. And so from there, you can work backwards and say, okay, now where can we find the talent? Where can education and training help us broaden the pipeline and tap into new reservoirs of talent? And in that regard, that social problem of people being stuck, of being under leveraged, becomes both a reservoir of potential, and it becomes, again, something that you got to solve. You can't win a game if half your team's on the bench. In a lot of economies, when you look at the number of people who are stuck on a treadmill of low wage employment, the number of people who have started at university and stopped out along the way, the number of people who got a degree and are working in jobs that don't require their degree, number of people who had to take time out for caregiving responsibilities and struggle to get back in. You add that up, in a lot of places, it is more than half of your team that's on the bench. And alternatively, you can start this the other direction. We know in a lot of jurisdictions, there's a greater and greater focus on accountability in education. How do we make sure, particularly in higher education, as the public's become a bit skeptical, how do we make sure that the investments that we're making in education training are working out? Well, in order to do that, we need to understand where's opportunity on the one side, and we need to understand the track record of the programs that we're investing in, which ones deliver good outcomes. Okay, now that means I actually have to build muscle around talking to employers. I need to be able to track and build data systems for understanding what happens to people over time. So in both ways, you wind up traveling the same road. You can travel from either direction, just don't start in the middle.
Got it.
I love your approach to coming to the table with a solution. A colleague of mine and I frequently speak to individuals who like to go to government and say, we're the best thing since sliced bread, just give us money and we can fix this for you. But we turn that around and say, what problem are you solving for them? Come to the table with a potential solution or part of a discussion that would enable them to see, I have something to provide here. How important is that in these discussions that you've been engaged with? Let's say just even in Houston and Detroit. Has that been part of the narrative and the discussion?
So I think the way I might frame it is this. What we often see is that, to your point, people are undertaking really important stuff, but it's only going to be a part of the problem. We all want to believe that there's a silver bullet out there. And the reality is that, of course, there's seldom silver bullets. Problems are complex. And most importantly, problems demand joint action. And so part of what enables, there's two things I would point to, at least to start, that can help catalyze better action. One is more effective convening. And to your point earlier on, convening isn't about celebrating a problem or even discussing a problem. It's about solving a problem. And what we find is that the bridges between education and employment are tenuous at best. A lot of colleges and universities will say, hey, we have an employer partnership program or something like that. When you look into it, what is it? It's we've got a donut breakfast twice a year, and somebody from the corporate social responsibility department of an employer in the neighborhood show up and they'll rail about it. We just want these days is kids who, are going to show up on time and not curse out their boss, and we'll train the rest, which of course isn't true. They won't train the rest. And every generation has been complaining about kids these days since time immemorial. But how do you get beyond that? How do you actually build muscle around talking to employers? Likewise, employers want educators to behave like vendors. And that may not be, this may be a little controversial, that may not be such a bad mindset. But if you're going to treat educators as vendors, then you need to give them a spec. You need to do all the things you do with vendors, measure them, give them feedback, fire the bad ones, give more business to the good ones. But we don't tend to do that as employers in terms of how we work with educators. So in both directions, we're missing the muscle. So that's one of the ways that I think if you can build those conversations, direct them towards shared purpose. And that gets me to the second piece, which is make sure that you are investing them with data. To your point specifically, often when you've got these organizations that have pieces of the problem, of the solution, they're not wrong. They're providing important inputs. And just in the same way that most communities have lots of great direct service organizations, which are out there doing heroes work on the ground, but without anything to help coordinate their efforts. Most communities are program rich and system poor. You've got the programs in place, you've got organizations that are trying to serve the public, but there's nothing that coordinates them. There's nothing that gives them the kind of information that they need to become more effective, the shared tools and services that can help them bridge. We can't expect a small community organization serving disadvantaged communities to become expert data analysts and to be able to mine the data that are out there describing where economic opportunity is and what skills. We need to make sure that there's a mechanism for shared insight and that doesn't require them to become PhDs in statistics.
So I want to pivot a little bit now and go to the world of AI. You can't open up a newspaper or open up a link somewhere and hear about the stories of AI is eliminating this. Jobs of the future will be this. We look at the World Economic Forum's projections in terms of number of jobs lost, but numbers of jobs created in the next 5 years. We also hear that AI is going to eliminate the traditional entry-level jobs as a training ground. Now, how do we look at, as you've indicated, that we need to train people to start their careers in the middle? Now, in this environment, what kinds of institutional innovations will get us to that? So traditionally apprenticeships, simulations, readiness assessments. What's going to help us get those individuals from the dislocated piece of the traditional entry-level jobs to that middle place, to starting in the middle?
So first, just a couple of grounding thoughts before we get to that question of how do we help people start not at the beginning as they're used to, but at a higher level of proficiency, or put differently, how do we help make sure that kids can do at 22 what they used to not need to do until they were 27 or 30. Before we get there, I just want to call out, I know there's a lot of talk about cataclysmic job effects. And while I think it's worth looking backwards to understand how these things tend to bear out over time, Spent some time recently studying past big technology revolutions from electricity to automobiles to most recently the internet. And what with general purpose technologies is that they actually tend to be wide and shallow for the most part, which is to say everyone winds up using them. They wind up becoming part of every job that's out there pretty much, but they tend not to necessarily lead really deep transformations in most jobs. Now, just to illustrate what I mean there, right? If you look today, we found that 90% of workers today are in jobs that make substantial use of the internet. But most of us are still doing the core work that we've done. So the internet changed, it gave us new tools, it changed some of our focus, but it didn't change some of the workflow for sure. My barber takes appointments on the internet instead of stopping cutting my hair and walking across it to answer the ringing phone. That's an improvement, but he's still cutting hair. And so I want to just temper, I share the anxiety about what could happen here. I don't want to minimize it, but I also want to bear in mind that what we see is that these changes take place over decades. We're still seeing the internet change jobs just over the last several years. We're now 27 years from 1998, and just over the last several years have we seen big declines in jobs like meter readers and in parking attendants. There's an app for that, but that literally took a couple decades. Likewise, some of the new jobs we can't even begin to anticipate. I can tell you it's not a prompt engineer in the same way that the internet didn't create jobs for Google search engineers, but it took from 1998 until 2010 before we actually had any substantive number of people working in social media, because it wasn't such a thing. You couldn't imagine it. Today in the United States, there's 65,000 people working as social media managers, but that's 27 years after the advent of the internet. That doesn't mean...
And I think that's an important context to frame this in, because there is the, oh my God, the sky is falling moment,
Yeah.
but it's so important to frame it the way you have. And we don't spend enough time having that part of the discussion for sure.
To your point, though, that doesn't mean just because overall these are wide but shallow movements, doesn't mean that life isn't pretty bad if you were a travel agent. So we can certainly see significant displacements. And certainly I think we can all imagine, given the strength of generative AI, that it could have potentially bigger effects than others. And really there's a timing question here more than anything else. I think I'd say more people probably believe than not, certainly I'm in this category, that just as past waves of technologies have always been net positive in terms of employment growth and prosperity, I believe AI will be as well. But as you put it, Curtis, the internet will, the Lord taketh away and the Lord giveth. We're going to see potentially jobs lost before we see jobs gained. And the question here is, what allows us to shrink the gap between them? What are the ways that we can have better insight about where job creation is taking place? How can we get that advanced intelligence? How can we develop in our education training system greater responsiveness? There's a bunch of steps that we can start to take that help us to get the timing right. So I know that's all prefatory to your question about proficiency. Proficiency is one of those sorts of things where, I'm glad you brought it up, because it's one of these places where we tend to get fixated on body counts, how many jobs are going to get lost, and the optimists saying how many jobs are going to get created. But actually what we're seeing empirically over the last 3 years, looking at our data, what we're able to see is that there are already big changes happening inside jobs. And that, in fact, again, when you look, one of the reasons I wanted to bring up that analogy in the internet, what the internet teaches us, most of the changes we're going to see are not about new jobs. They're not about jobs going away. They're going to be about what happens inside jobs. We know that, for example, just over the last 3 years since LLMs first stormed the scene, the skills that are most automated have declined about 17% in demand. The skills that are most augmented across jobs in any given job, the skills that are most augmented are grown about 7%. So you're starting to already see changes in the underlying skills. And proficiency is one of those sorts of things where it'd be easy to miss. But likewise, we've already seen very material changes in employer hiring patterns, changes in the share of their hiring away from hiring at the entry level and toward hiring people with more experience, which is interesting because people have been talking about this being a soft hiring market. In soft hiring markets, you usually see the opposite. You want to, if you've got a recession going on, you want to get rid of the expensive people and hire the cheap entry level people. And here what we're seeing is that employers are saying, no, I actually want the expensive people, please. And so and we're seeing that particularly in the jobs that are most automation, most AI vulnerable. And to your question, how do we solve that? How do we make sure that, because this could be a real problem for young workers. How do you get on the ladder when the bottom rungs are getting knocked out? And it's also a big problem for employers and policymakers. How do we develop a pipeline of talent? We're going to start to need more jobs with higher levels of expertise, but we don't have we no longer have the entry level by which people gain that expertise. You could wind up with a serious problem there. And you talked about some of the solutions that I think are very important for helping students gain, whether through simulations, through internships and other work-based learning experiences. How do we use those as mechanisms to increase the level of intrinsic learning, the kind of learning that you can only do on the job, even before they step out of school?
Yeah, and that's a large debate that's going on with many of the post-secondaries and governments that I've been interacting with is how do we create that space, that work integrated learning component, that assurance that this is actually being achieved? When students are coming out of the system, they're already familiar with some of the environment and the activities and the expectations, but it's still just floating around. It's not embedded.
And a couple of thoughts there. One, we need to first start by understanding what are those skills that students are going to need to have higher level of proficiency in. Because if we don't know that, then we can't direct the work-based learning experiences and the like toward where they're most needed. That's especially important because what we know already is that too few students are getting those work-based learning opportunities. And in our research, we found that work-based learning, internships, and the like are singularly important in determining long-term career outcomes, whether through some work that we're doing right now and understanding why certain higher education institutions perform in terms of the career outcomes of their students. The biggest single factor is the share of students who have a work-based learning experience, whether it's in what helps students avoid underemployment, that is the very high prevalence of students who come out of university and wind up in a job that they didn't need their degree to get. Likewise, the single biggest factor, cuts in half the risk, is having even a single internship. We know too many students don't get those, so we need to know what are the things they need to get proficient at. The second thing is really asking the question, if we were to make a commitment that said every student in our province is going to get a meaningful work-based learning experience, and you were to try to work backward from that goal, what would you have to do? And it's a really interesting thought exercise because it seems like a facile check to write, but think about how you have to change school schedules, think about the level of engagement with employers that would be required, the level of integration of preparatory training that would enable students to be effective contributors. You'd want to start to take a look at the jobs that students hold on the side. We know that most students in college and university, even many students in high school, are working. But right now, in the world of higher education, we treat that as a necessary evil. Okay, Matt has to work. Perhaps he's cleaning dishes somewhere just to be able to pay his bills and support his studies. Instead of saying, hey, maybe that's actually an opportunity for us to be able to help Matt gain experiences that will give him a better shot when he graduates.
Wow.
Matt, This is really building on something that I wanted to ask about. And it comes from a place that's a bit of a personal question in a sense, because I have two young kids who are going to be going into post-secondary, I suspect, at some point in the next couple of years. And there is a quote of yours that I quite like, and it ties to what you were just talking about, which is you don't need a degree to succeed, but you do need a map. And when you talk about the importance of a map, one of the things that it reminds me of, and I'm going to get a bit nerdy here, but it ties into like video games and skills trees that are developed in video games to structure progression. And these trees are built to give transparency. So these are the foundational capabilities that you can use to build advanced ones or unlock advanced ones. These are hybrid builds. These are the of the skill sets, and helping you understand one path versus another. When you talk about a map and using the reference of a map, what would you tell, and this is me asking personally, what would you tell a 16-year-old today about preparing now for the world of work that you see ahead?
Look, there are a few 16-year-olds out there who may have already discovered that passion and know what they're going to do. The vast majority don't.
Yeah.
I'm blessed with 5 kids. One of them, my 16-year-old, in fact, does know, I think, what he wants to do, but I'm fairly certain my other 4 are definitely not there. They've got a little bit more time to catch up, but I don't think that's going to be the case. And that wouldn't be what I'd really focus on. Obviously, if you do know what it is, that makes developing the map easier. But I'd focus on a few other things instead. The first is about learning how to learn. Now, that's a glib statement, but it's worth saying in the age of AI, because I think we take as a given right now, we're looking at how fast this technology is evolving and we're saying, how can we keep up? And the real question instead is, where does AI make you more valuable? And the ability to acquire new skills, to be able to apply your judgment, is the ability to be able to continually keep ahead and continually to shape your own course and define who you are. I was really lucky to go to an exceptional school. It was exceptional in a number of ways beyond the fact that there was a student smoking lounge, but I'm sure that's long gone away. But in any case, I bring it up because I was talking to a friend recently and classmate, and she said the best thing that school gave us was it taught us how to reinvent ourselves. And I think that comes down to really recognizing that most of us actually won't necessarily have the long-term map. Probably across the 3 of us today, I'm not sure that we all know where we're necessarily going over the coming 10, 20 years. I'm not sure what I'm going to do when I'm going to grow it up. But if we can have a sense for what are the things I want to learn next, that can help us get ahead. I think key to that then is focusing on the foundations. Generative AI makes capabilities, particularly technical capabilities, but a range of capabilities more accessible to us. But that means we need to have a conceptual foundation for understanding those. I keep hearing people talk about how you don't need to know how to code anymore because generative AI can generate code for you. And it's complete rubbish. The reality is that generative AI is going to, precisely because it makes coding more accessible, means that more of us are going to code. If you would, I stopped coding with Fortran, but now I'm actually creating little apps on my own. But it's working because I've got that conceptual basis to do it. And that leads to the last thing I might say to a 16-year-old today, which is easier said than done, given all the temptations that are out there, but which is to use AI to scale yourself rather than to replace yourself. One of the things that worries me today in terms of how so many educators are burying their heads in the sand about this is that we're telling students in ignoring AI, in saying that we're not going to give any attention to this. We ignore the fact that, of course, students know it's out there, and we know that chat can write a pretty competent essay. And so it's the student, when they do that, is effectively replacing themselves. Hey, I used to be the one to have to write that essay, and now I can just ask ChatGPT to do it, and I can go out and play nuclear option or whatever. But the real question is, what are the things that make me uniquely valuable?
Mm.
And how do I use AI to amplify those? And that's a different process altogether. And we need to make sure that we're helping young people identify the capabilities, both the foundational learning that they need to do, the applied capabilities, that ensure that they are making themselves worth more and not less over time.
I feel like that's a skill set that's going to have to be developed like at the K to 12 level, right? Like this starts as soon as they start learning. Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that.
Listen, Matt, we have taken all the time we can with you. I wish we had many more opportunities and many more hours to chat, but we truly appreciate your time and your analysis of this. But it goes back to the thing that these are conversations that many folks are not having. And I really do appreciate your time and your frankness with us. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you both. So enjoyed this.
Thank you, Matt.
Take care, Matt.
Take care. So Curtis, that was again awesome. The conversation with Matt was very enlightening. I took quite a few notes around some pretty powerful quotes. Really, that last conversation in particular around AI and looking at it completely differently, or looking at it more from a positive lens as opposed to a threatening lens, and the impact that it can have on the generations that's now learning and living in AI and will continue to do so going forward is super enlightening. And I have some good conversations ahead with my kids for sure as a result of that. So I'm very appreciative of that. I think the other thing that I took away was that he reminded us that transformation starts best with some intentional sequencing and with sort of a bit of a roadmap and the willingness to come to a convening experience, not to admire the problem, but to actually work on solving for. And that the problems are complex and there's no shying away from that, but you need to chip away at it and really start to think about where can we make the most traction in the best way possible. And I just think there's a lot of good value in framing things in that light. And hopefully there's some organizations and leaders out there who are looking to make that convening opportunity happen for these conversations to move forward. What were some of your big takeaways?
I really did appreciate his approach to the ecosystem, looking at that this is not just one player or the other. It's also understanding the various perspectives of those members or those constituent members within that ecosystem. His conversation about Houston and Detroit, looking at from the economic perspective, but the social components of this development of not only the skills, but the economic framing and how all of these need to work together. And where we've fallen down is when we've looked at only one perspective.
Yeah.
I found that very powerful, especially in these times where we tend to easily go into the silo approach when in fact we need to be working more collectively in those solutions and the development of those solutions as well. I just found it quite remarkable how he's used that lens in so many different sort of instances.
Excellent conversation today. The future of work's not going to wait for any one individual silo to get their act together. It's going to need all of those silos to start to harmonize. And I think unless we can get that happening, it's going to be difficult as we go. So yeah.
And I can hardly wait till our next conversation. If this is any sense of what it is, it's going to be so much fun. Thank you again,
Looking forward
Troy.
to it. Thank you. Take care.
Ciao.